All right, so I know a guy who's reading AOPA magazine. Okay, it was Rob. Anyway, he sent me this little picture of the page he was reading where Daniel Sternberg sent AOPA a letter to the editor. He's a patron of the show. It goes a little something like this. It says, "Listen up. Did you miss any of my favorites? You sure did. May I draw your attention to podcasting on a plane?" By Brandon Gonzalez, who's a pilot, CFI, tower controller, and airplane crash survivor. So many great episodes and interesting guests, but particularly worth checking out our Concorde Week, which is episodes 33 through 36, and Spy Week, episodes 61 through 65, and ongoing coverage of the MAX saga. Daniel Sternberg. And Daniel's a patron of this show and a former guest and all-around good guy, so thank you, Daniel, for sending that to one of the all-time great aviation magazines. But why would I start the show with that? It's not a humble brag, don't worry. I guess the point is just that it got me thinking. And in the old school, where print magazines were all we had, letters like that were pretty much how content creators, also before they were called that too, of course, would interact with the readership. But now, I think it's so cool that we have the ability to actually talk with the content creators we like. And one of my favorite parts of doing this podcast thing is talking with those of you that listen and then actually come up with really good feedback and questions. And as we kiss goodbye to the worst year on record of really my lifetime and start 2021 with a healthy amount of cautious optimism, now, I can't say that I'll be changing the show fundamentally, but if there are any resolution-style changes I'd like, it would be to get you all on the show more. And that's be it through voice feedback or emails or whatever. But to that end, I've got quite a bit of it today, actually. Questions, comments, a little something for everyone. So let's get to it. Oh, yeah, and we're going to talk about that little $2.5 billion payout Boeing owes, too. Don't go away. Before I start reading about the final phase of the MAX saga, I want to take a second to thank those of you who support the show. This whole thing is supported by listener support, and to that end, the show's ad-free. There's a number of ways you can show support. All of them are found on the website, podcastingonaplane.com. You just click on Support the Show, and you'll find out how to become a per-episode patron on Patreon, or you could maybe click the link to buymeacoffee.com/Bravo Golf, spelled out. And that's what Matt Horde did. And he bought 3 coffees at Buy Me a Coffee, and he left a note saying, "Thanks for your effort and dedication." Well, Matt, thank you for your support of the show. And here's the interesting part, though, is that Matt works for a company that usually builds controls for things like zoos and aquariums, I guess. But he got a job that involves redesigning airfield lighting controls for airports like mine. And he asked me to provide some feedback. So we talked for a while, and hopefully some of the stuff we discussed will be written into the controls for future systems of airfield lighting control. Pretty cool. So now let's get on to the Boeing stuff. And if you haven't really kept up with this because, I don't know, maybe you have more important things to do in your life, I'm just going to fill you in because this is kind of the end of the chapter. As people start getting requalled on the 737 MAX and as airlines start flying them again, there's still this whole little low-lying thing about how much money Boeing owes to everybody. And the number is $244 million penalty to settle fraud charges tied to 737 MAX crashes, according to the Seattle Times by Dominic Gates and Louis Kamm. And you'll remember that them at the Seattle Times, well, they've been covering the MAX saga probably better than anybody, and we've read several of their articles on the show, and this one's going to be no exception. So let's go ahead and get down to this one from January 7th. It says Boeing has agreed to pay just over $2.5 billion to resolve a federal charge of criminal misconduct for how its employees misled regulatory officials during certification of the MAX, the Department of Justice announced Thursday. Of that amount, only $243.6 million, less than 10%, is a fine paid to the U.S. government for the criminal conduct, quote, which reflects a fine at the low end, end quote, of the sentencing guidelines, the court agreement states. The rest includes an additional $500 million Boeing commits to pay in compensation to the families of the 346 people who died in the 2 crashes of the MAX. However, 70% of the $2.5 billion cited in the settlement, or $1.77 billion, is compensation to Boeing's airline customers that the company has already agreed to pay. And indeed, that's just a fraction of what it's agreed to pay them. The agreement stipulates that if Boeing meets a series of requirements, the charge of criminal fraud will be dropped after 3 years. Crucially, this avoids a potential criminal conviction of Boeing as a company. And that's important for Boeing as a key U.S. defense contractor. The conviction could have excluded them from future government contracts. With that possibility looming, large corporations typically opt for this kind of, quote, deferred prosecution settlement rather than taking their chances in court. U.S. House Transportation Committee Chair Pete DeFazio, Democrat from Oregon, who led major investigation into the crashes and who last month helped propel into law major reform of the FAA's certification process, called the agreement, quote, a slap on the wrist and an insult to the victims. Quote, the settlement sidesteps any real accountability in terms of criminal charges, DeFazio said. Quote, from where I sit, this attempt to change corporate behavior is pathetic. Senior management and the Boeing board were not held to account, and in fact, the former CEO skated out with more than $60 million, end quote. Zipporah Curria of the UK, who lost her father, Joseph Curria Waithaka, age 55, in the crash of Ethiopian 302 in March 2019, called the news, quote, somewhat bittersweet. Quote, "It won't bring back our loved ones, but at least there's clarity that their deaths weren't incidental and there is clarity in liability," Correa said in a statement. However, she added that for Boeing, the penalty, quote, "doesn't even scratch the surface of justice." The individuals responsible at Boeing should not be retiring or resigning with bonuses. They should be held criminally liable for their actions, she said. The criminal complaint charges the company with one count of conspiracy to defraud the government by supplying false information to the FAA during certification of the jet. The Department of Justice said the criminal charges center on the conduct of two 737 MAX program employees, Chief Technical Pilot Mark Faulkner and his deputy Patrick Gustafson, whose job was to finalize the pilot training requirements for the airplane. Those two, quote, "deceived the FAA," end quote, about a new flight control system on the MAX, the MCAS, that activated erroneously to cause both crashes, the DOJ said. Quote, "Because of their deception, a key document published by the FAA Airplane Evaluation Group lacked information about MCAS, and in turn, airplane manuals and pilot training materials for U.S.-based airlines lacked information about MCAS," the DOJ said. Acting Assistant Attorney General Dave Burns of the Justice Department's Criminal Division said, quote, "Boeing's employees chose the path of profit over candor by concealing material information from the FAA concerning the operation of its 737 MAX airplane and engaging in an effort to cover up their deception. This resolution holds Boeing accountable for its employees' criminal misconduct, addresses the financial impact to Boeing's airline customers, and hopefully provides some measure of compensation to the crash victims' families and beneficiaries," Burns said. Neither Faulkner nor Gustafson nor other Boeing employees who were interviewed by the FBI have been charged. However, the court document notes that the agreement protects only the company, not individuals, from prosecution. It further notes that the evidence arising from the DOJ investigation may be used to bring charges of perjury, obstruction of justice, or making a false statement. Quote, "Patrick Gustafson never hid anything from the FAA or any pilot," his attorney James Bennett said in a statement on Thursday. Quote, "He has been completely committed to the safety of passengers and crew, and any claim to the contrary is false," end quote. Faulkner's attorney, David Gerger, did not respond to a request for comment Thursday. However, early last year, he issued a statement saying that Faulkner, quote, "did his job honestly and his communications to the FAA were honest," end quote. Responding to the news Thursday, lawyers for the families of the victims of Ethiopian 302 dismissed the focus on the wrongdoing of the two technical pilots as, quote, "just the tip of the iceberg of Boeing's wrongdoing," end quote. In a statement, lawyers Rob Clifford, Stephen Marks, and Justin Green characterized the DOJ agreement as Boeing paying, quote, "billions of dollars to avoid criminal liability while stonewalling and fighting the families in court." This agreement, including the Crash Victim Beneficiaries Fund, has no bearing on the pending civil litigation against Boeing, which we plan to prosecute fully to ensure the families receive the justice they deserve, they said. The legal team added, quote, "The FAA should not have allowed the 737 MAX to return to service pending transparent and independent safety reviews." After grounding the MAX for 20 months, though, in November, the FAA allowed the MAX to resume flying following protracted design reviews and technical improvements. International regulators are set to follow this month. In addition, Boeing must meet with the fraud section at least quarterly and submit yearly reports regarding proposals to ensure its compliance with U.S. and foreign government regulations. David Calhoun, Boeing's chief executive officer, in a note to employees Thursday, called the agreement, quote, "a substantial settlement of a very serious matter. I firmly believe that entering into this resolution is the right thing for us to do, a step that appropriately acknowledges how we fell short of our values and expectations," he said. Boeing sought to mitigate the impact of the charge by noticing that, quote, "two former Boeing employees," end quote, were involved in the criminal conduct cited. Calhoun's message to employees recalled the infamous text message and email exchanges between the two pilots, full of derogatory remarks about the FAA, the airlines, suppliers, and Boeing colleagues that the company belatedly turned over to the FAA and the DOJ. Quote, "This agreement reflects that those former employees, in addition to showing deep disrespect for our regulators and customers, also intentionally failed to inform FAA training officials about changes in MCAS's design," Calhoun wrote. Quote, "The agreement recognizes that other Boeing employees did not inform other officials and organizations within the FAA about MCAS," Boeing said in a statement. Quote, "While we deeply regret the conduct described in the agreement, I am confident that it isn't reflective of our employees as a whole or the culture or character of our company," Calhoun told employees. Indeed, the DOJ fraud section concluded that, quote, "the misconduct was neither pervasive across the organization, nor undertaken by a large number of employees, nor facilitated by senior management." Nevertheless, the DOJ press statement emphasized the culpability of the company for, quote, "misleading statements, half-truths, and omissions," end quote, that the two pilots communicated to the FAA. Quote, "This case sends a clear message. The Department of Justice will hold manufacturers like Boeing accountable for defrauding regulators, especially in industries where the stakes are this high," said the U.S. Attorney for Northern District of Texas, Aaron Neely Cox. Boeing's development of the MAX fell tragically short in other ways besides the one where Faulkner and Gustafson were implicated, the lack of pilot training and the omission of any information for the airlines about MCAS. Incomplete and fragmentary information about the design and potential danger of MCAS was provided to the FAA's safety engineers, and Boeing managers brought, quote, "undue pressure to bear on some of its engineers who were evaluating the jet systems on behalf of the FAA. A Boeing engineer, Curtis Eubank, blew the whistle internally after the second crash about the flight control system improvements proposed for the MAX that might have prevented the accidents but were rejected on cost grounds. Eubank also drew attention to the inadequacies in the crew alerting system on the MAX that were never addressed because Boeing, at the insistence of its airline customers, decided to keep the flight deck on the MAX largely unchanged from the previous 737 model. However, the DOJ does not mention any criminal wrongdoing in these failures. Under the terms of the agreement, Boeing must pay $243.6 million as a, quote, criminal monetary penalty, $500 million to a fund to compensate relatives of the 346 passengers who died in the two crashes, and $1.77 billion in compensation payments to Boeing's MAX airline customers. Boeing said that with the compensation to customers already included in the previous quarterly disclosures, it will declare an accounting write-off of $743.6 million for the other two amounts in the fourth quarter. Aside from the cost of compensating victims' families, Boeing has previously estimated the total cost of the MAX grounding in extra production expenses and customer compensation costs at $20.6 billion, including $8.8 billion in compensation to the airlines. Chuck Herman, a Tacoma-based attorney who represents families of 51 victims of the two crashes, said Thursday Boeing previously had distributed $144,500 to the beneficiaries of each of the 346 crash victims from a $50 million compensation fund set up by the company in 2019. Herman confirmed with the Justice Department Thursday afternoon that the $500 million compensation requirement is additional to this previously distributed money. Family members of the scores of victims of the two crashes have also separately filed civil lawsuits against Boeing. More than 40 of Herman's clients have agreed to settlements for undisclosed amounts protected by confidentiality agreements, with 9 of his cases still pending, he said. Quote, there was deception in several directions, and they definitely deserve to be punished. Boeing deceived the FAA, their customers, and the pilots of their airplanes. All of that's important, and this action today reveals that, Herman said. Quote, I'm reasonably satisfied that Boeing's deception has been revealed, and they can't deny it, end quote. Yet Michael Stumo, father of Samia Rose Stumo, age 24, who died in the Ethiopian crash, said the settlement, quote, holds no one at the company accountable, and called the fine, quote, a rounding error for Boeing. Quote, this settlement is protection for Boeing rather than justice, Stumo said. Quote, it's a continuation of Boeing evading accountability and transparency, end quote. Wall Street analysts, whose eyes are fixed on the implications for the share price, see the fine as not material for Boeing. Doug Harnett of Bernstein Research told investors in a note Thursday that $743 million write-off, quote, should not be a significant issue for the stock, end quote. The court filing explains the leniency in the size of the fine by noting that Boeing received partial credit from investors for, quote, voluntarily and proactively identifying potentially significant documents, end quote, presumably the message exchanges between Faulkner and Gustafsson. However, the agreement says that such cooperation, quote, was delayed and only began after the first 6 months of the investigation, during which the company's response frustrated the DOJ's fraud section investigation, end quote. The DOJ also cited Boeing's efforts after the crash to make changes that enhance oversight and accountability within various internal engineering and safety organizations. The FBI's special agent in charge at the agency's Chicago field office, Emerson Bowie Jr., said the penalties in the DOJ agreement, quote, demonstrate the consequences of failing to be fully transparent with government regulators. The public should be confident that government regulators are effectively doing their job, and those they regulate are being truthful and transparent, he added. From the Department of Transportation Office of Inspector General, Special Agent in charge for the Midwestern region, Andrea M. Kropf, she said, quote, this landmark deferred prosecution agreement will forever serve as a stark reminder of the paramount importance of safety in the commercial aviation industry, and that integrity and transparency may never be sacrificed for efficiency or profit. Again, this article ran in the Seattle Times. It's by Dominic Gates, Louis Cam, and Mike Carter, who contributed to the story. Make sure to check the show notes for the link to that article. So where does that put Boeing? I have an article by Guy Norris, January 12, 2021, from Aviation Week, called Decimated Boeing 2020 Deliveries Reflect MAX and Pandemic Impacts. He says, final year-end figures show just 157 Boeing airliners were delivered in 2020 compared to 380 in 2019, revealing the full impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic and the prolonged grounding of the 737 MAX on the company's commercial business. Released as part of Boeing's fourth quarter production statement, the tally includes 43 737s, 31 of which were delivered in the final weeks of the year following the ungrounding of the MAX by the FAA in December 2020. The drop in 737 deliveries has been primarily responsible for the precipitous decrease in overall Boeing commercial deliveries over the past 2 years. These declined from a peak of 806 in 2018 to 380 in 2019, before sliding again to just 157 in 2020. Of the 2018 total, some 580 were 737 models, while the small twin jet made up for 127 of the 2019 total. However, while deliveries of 737s are due to step up significantly in 2021 as previously completed aircraft are retrieved from storage and new production steps up, the delivery numbers also underline another potentially serious problem with the 787. Only 53 787s were delivered in 2020 compared to 145 in 2018 and 158 in 2019. Of 2020's tally, only 4 787s were delivered in the last quarter amid ongoing manufacturing issues and inspections. Commenting on the status of the program, which is in the midst of being transferred from Everett, Washington to Boeing's South Carolina facility, company CFO Greg Smith said, quote, "We also continued comprehensive inspections of our 787 airplanes to ensure they meet our highest quality standards prior to delivery. While limiting our 787 deliveries for the quarter, those comprehensive inspections represent our focus on safety, quality, and transparency, and we're confident we're taking the right steps for our customers and for the long-term health of the 787 program." But the smaller-than-expected delivery numbers for the last 3 months have taken industry watchers by surprise, and some, such as analysts company Bernstein, suggest this may be a warning of worse news to come. In a recent note to investors, the company says the, quote, "main 787 worry was long delivery delays could lead to repricing or substantial compensation. The second biggest concern was that there may be extensive costs to inspect and repair airplanes in the field. This is very uncertain," end quote. In other programs, 2 of Boeing's commercial stalwarts, the 767 and 777, fared relatively better and provided the company with valuable income over the year. Although Boeing announced in 2020 the first deliveries of the 777X will be delayed till 2022, production of the 777 continues with freighter versions making up significantly greater proportions of the annual total than in previous years. Of the 26 777s delivered in 2020, 22 were freighters. Bolstered by production of 767-300F freighter variants and the KC-46A military tanker, deliveries of the 767 hit 30 in 2020 compared to 43 in 2019 and 27 in 2018. The 747-8F production, of which is due to be phased out in 2022, also continued to be delivered at a slow rate, with 5 handed over to UPS during the year, of which 3 were in the last quarter. Overall, Boeing delivered 46 freighter versions of the 76, 77, and 747-8. Representing a record 40% of the overall 114 wide-body deliveries made in 2020. Boeing also ended the year with 4,223 aircraft in its backlog, down 22% since the end of 2019, and this was due mainly to pandemic-related cancellations and accounting adjustments, and included cancellations made in December for 107 aircraft, of which 105 were for the MAX. Of the remaining backlog, 3,321 are 737s, 8 are 747-8Fs, 75 are 76s, 350 are 777s, and 469 are 787s. Again, this article by Guy Norris at Aviation Week. He's a senior editor based in Los Angeles. And now it's time for a new segment of the show I'd like to call, "Oh, gee, really?" Patron Russ Irwin, who we're also going to hear a question from in a minute, sent me this. It's from theaircurrent.com. And the article is titled, "Boeing's MCAS on the 737 MAX may not have been needed at all. The haunting postscript to the 737 MAX's infamous flight control system." And here's the thing about this, is most of the article talks about stuff we already know and we've covered several times. Why the 737 MAX was rushed to market, how it was done, the fact that they didn't want pilot training expenses, all that stuff. I'm not going to cover it again. But I'm going to go down to kind of near the end of the article where it really answers the question of, was MCAS necessary at all? This one haunting question still hangs over the tragic saga. In completing its evaluation of the 737 MAX for returning to service in Europe, Patrick Kai, Executive Director for the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, settled a central question that hung over the MAX development. The inclusion of the larger LEAP engines did not impact the overall stability of the 737 MAX. Quote, "We also pushed the aircraft to its limits during flight tests, assessed the behavior of the aircraft in failure scenarios, and could confirm that the aircraft is stable and has no tendency to pitch up, even without the MCAS," said Kai. In the Air Current's interviews with pilots, engineers, and U.S. officials, much of the engineering consideration around the MAX's handling centered on the observed data during flight testing rather than pilot impressions of actual differences in aircraft handling compared to a 73NG. FAA Administrator Steve Dixon at a February 2020 media briefing said that the regulator had, quote, "gone back and looked at the airplane with the stall characteristics with and without the current MCAS system, and the stall characteristics are acceptable in either case," end quote. Those who have flown the MAX in engineering tests tell the Air Current that much of the differences in handling qualities with MCAS present are not marginally perceptible, quote, "once you know what to look for," end quote, and it produces a, quote, "slightly softer feel," end quote, in the aircraft's control for stall recovery. Dixon had flown the 757 and 767 for Delta Airlines, 2 airplanes that were designed together under a common pilot type rating. One's known by pilots as an overpowered hot rod, and the other's known as a whale. While connected under the same rating for pilots, the 2 airplanes, one a single aisle and the other a small twin aisle, have different stall characteristics. The Air Current asked Dixon on the sidelines of the Singapore Air Show in February 2020 that if the agency was on board with 2 different aircraft handling styles under the same pilot rating as for the 76 and 75, then why didn't Boeing seek a waiver from the FAA for pilots flying the 73NG and the 73 MAX two different aircraft with slightly different handling characteristics. Quote, "I don't think we'll ever know," said Dixon. "The applicant brings forward a proposal. We evaluate the proposal. And I've asked the same question myself." Now, the interesting part is that following publication, an FAA spokesman on January 11th provided an additional statement regarding Administrator Dixon's comments around Boeing's selected path for meeting federal aviation regulations for the original implementation of the MCAS on the MAX. The Air Current sought and received comment from the FAA in advance of the publication, and it's reflected in the story above. But they provide the latest response in full. It says, "Any questions the administrator raised about MCAS were in the nature of understanding the genesis of its addition to the flight control system and not a judgment on whether it was needed. That call has been and always will be left to the flight test pilots and engineers who are trained and qualified to make such determinations. The fact of the matter is that the FAA and other authorities determined during a 20-month review that MCAS was a necessary part of the flight control system. We all reviewed and approved the changes to the system as part of the recent certification. This is directly addressed in the 100-plus page report that was filed with the Airworthiness Directive. We made it clear that the aircraft would not have been compliant with the stick force and G requirements at higher angle of attack without MCAS or some other type of mechanism. The FAA does not tell applicants how to design planes, so the choice to develop the MCAS was an engineering decision on the part of Boeing. The FAA's role is to evaluate and approve proposed designs against the regulatory requirements." Again, that article by John Ostrower at theaircurrent.com. The end. All right, that's that. Now, I don't know if OG really is going to become a permanent fixture on the show, but hey, if you have any news that fits into that category, I think it might actually be kind of fun, so can't wait to see what you send in. But anyway, speaking of fun stuff like that, let's hear from you. Like I promised earlier, one of the coolest parts of doing the show is that people all over the world listen to the show. So people in the UK and as far as New Zealand, which is from where I am sitting here in San Diego, California, pretty much as opposite part of the world as you can possibly get. Now, we all know Glenn Towler. He's a patron of the show, and he's in Wellington, New Zealand, and he has this to say.
G'day, Brendan. It's Glenn here, your mate from New Zealand. Rich Pickett, what an inspiration. And his story about the virus and how he managed to get over it. It's just, I think it should be played to anyone who thinks that the virus isn't that bad and that, it's just the flu or, I don't need to wear a mask because it's, it only happens to certain people. It makes me very glad that I live here in New Zealand and we pretty much don't have the virus except a few people who are actually in these isolation centers. They have to spend like 2 weeks there and get tested several times before they're allowed out. So, yeah, it's just it's really glad that the vaccine's out now, of course. I've said to people, look, we really don't need the vaccine that much because we don't really have the virus here. So, but I want I want the vaccine so I can travel to places like Oshkosh and meet up with all my friends again. So, well, anyway, keep up the great work and Happy New Year to you and all the rest of the listeners. Glenn out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, and obviously, as this thing drags on, I think the frustration's kind of getting to all of us, but I, for one, cannot wait for the world to return to some amount of functionality. I hate using the terms new normal, but that's probably the best we have for now. But at any rate, just at least a functional reality where the pandemic is more or less behind us. We can travel internationally and, we can go to Oshkosh at the very least. But hey, regards to Rich Pickett, that was obviously an inspirational episode. I've got probably actually as much feedback from that one as really any show that I've done in some time, except for maybe Pam. And we're going to talk about her as well. But I got another one in writing after the Rich Pickett episode. But Elliot Cox, he's a show patron. He made a really cool observation. He says, "Fantastic episode. Rich sounds like a Frank Abagnale if he would have played it straight. Thanks to both of you guys for the inspiration." And of course, if you don't remember who Frank Abagnale is, go back and watch Catch Me If You Can. And I sent that to Rich himself, actually, and he responded, "Elliot, to you, interesting comparison. He probably never said no when asked to do something either." And I think that has every bit as much to do with your success in aviation as your flying skills do, honestly, and probably just about any part of your life, actually, for that matter. In addition to just listening to a fascinating guy talk about doing fascinating things, I really hope that that's what people took away from episode 87, too. And friend and show patron Rob Mark had this to say after the Pam episode.
Hey, Brandon, it's Rob out in Chicago, and I just had a comment about episode 86. Well, actually, I have a comment to a listener comment. It was about the fellow that wanted to know why in the LSA he got sent around when there was a meridian behind him. And for people that don't know me, I used to be a controller back in the old days when we used to light torches on the ground to keep airplanes apart. Okay, anyway, that was another time. But one thing I find at a lot of places that do a really good job of air traffic, especially at VFR airports, is that the controller will tell the pilot what's going on, so that the meridian doesn't eat up the LSA. You tell, whether they're IFR or VFR, tell them, hey, by the way, you're number 2 behind a guy that's he's only doing 50 knots across the ground, and you're about 3 miles behind him. So adjust your speed or whatever. When a controller can give a pilot some kind of heads up like that, I think it's really important. So anyway, thanks for the chance to comment, and we'll talk to you soon. See ya.
Yeah, Rob and I love talking about air traffic control and kind of how things go now versus how they used to be. And sometimes we reveal stuff that's changed a lot, and then other times, nothing's changed in so many years. But that's a really good point that he makes here, because the best controllers are those who have you so well informed that you know exactly what's going on. And this was before ADS-B and things like that. I mean, obviously now you can look at your display and pretty much put together the picture that the controller is looking at as well. Now, one of the things that I tell my trainees when I'm training somebody at work, a new controller or something, or even just somebody who's very experienced that's come to our facility, is that at a particularly VFR, really busy place like I work, you need to keep everybody as informed as possible, because then they can actually do something. And the reason it's busy sometimes is not just traffic congestion or traffic volume, but it's just the weird mix that we get at some of these super busy deltas that are not only full of clubs and schools, but also a lot of jet traffic, all the charters and so on. So, when you're mixing Piper Cubs with Global Expresses and Gulfstreams, you really need to have everybody on the same page, because if somebody doesn't know what's going on and they're just kind of passively listening, it doesn't go well. So I do what's called the Jerry Maguire, right? Help me, help you. And I feel that if I give you as much information as possible, like that guy's going this fast, or you're following the aircraft off your right, they're going to do a touch and go, or they're going to be a full stop, or expect them to use the full runway, blah, 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 then that gives you the information that you need to space yourself accordingly. And then I can move on to something else while you work to space yourself appropriately, because now I've given you enough to know that. And Pam and I talked about that a bit, and you can tell just in the way she talks now, even though she's a retired controller, I can just hear her saying in that voice that she has that concise yet still extremely informative way of telling everybody exactly what's going on and that little bit of information that you need to make the choice. Because any good controller, and obviously Pam is one of them, can know that you need to know something and then just put that right in there in that transmission and then move on. So again, the Jerry Maguire, help me, help you. And it goes two ways. ATC is a two-way street. We say that all the time, right? If you have something you think I should know, or a need or something like, hey, we're going to use this whole runway or something, I don't know, surprise me, but we can work better that way too. So Rob, thank you so much for that. And I can't wait to have you back on the show. I got another really interesting one from show patron Russ Irwin. He's up in the California Bay Area, and he was asking about flight following. And this is a service that I think is very, very important. A lot of people don't, because, it's VFR. It might be not as high priority as IFR. And I get that, the system designed around IFR, but Tower is giving flight following. How come some do and some don't? Let's read his email. He says, Brandon, why will some deltas deliver IFR clearances or arrange flight following and others will not? They just give you a frequency to call when airborne, assuming you're departing in VMC. Thanks, Russ. So here's what I said to him. It's a good question. This is probably one of the most inconsistent air traffic control things around. Possible reason number one, the tower doesn't have the same or compatible ARTS or STARS equipment to type in the info and then hand off to departure. And that's more likely in remote areas where the overlying radar is probably a center and not a TRACON. Possible reason number two, the overlying TRACON doesn't like or want the tower to do it since they feel it sort of commits them to providing services they may not want or may not even be able to provide at the time. And possible reason number three, the tower controller just might not really know how to do it properly or doesn't want to for some reason. You do what you will with that. But fun fact, I used to do it all the time, like 10 years ago when I started. And some departure controllers liked it, others didn't. The old school stance at the overlying TRACON was just generally not happy about it. Again, the old school was different. But the new breed of controllers are quite a bit more receptive of knowing who everyone is, though. And then it became official that it's a service that towers under the SoCal airspace will provide that only maybe about 5 years ago. And there's still a couple of the old school grumpy types out there kind of topping the seniority list, but, maybe you get a bad one, maybe you don't. But for the most part, the new generation is far more interested in data and information than, feeling as if they don't want to have to work any more planes than they have to. But equipment aside, it's kind of just a matter of time, I think, until it's standardized across the NAS. So to that, he said, I have to say the answer is interesting for its ambiguity. I thought there'd be some simple answer because I sort of thought the FAA has rules for the NAS that dictate behaviors under different circumstances. And as a pilot on the other end of the mic, I'm always trying to look past what happens to understand the what and the why based on the assumption that there's some system back there that ATC has that I better understand and they'll be a better pilot. Kind of like how people look at their A&P and say, why is it doing that? Well, I find myself doing that with ATC. He also says that podcasts like yours are sort of the user's manual for ATC. Sure, we have the aim, but it's a bit distanced from reality. And then everyday controllers tell us to do X or report Y when established. But look up established in the aim or the pilot controller glossary and you find nada. Even worse, look up join the approach and more silence. So you and others are an important part of helping pilots, especially relatively new ones like myself with about 400 hours, understand what's happening at the other end. And he also mentions that to reason number one, you're right, I've experienced this more where the overlying radar is center. And I guess since I can sit on the ground at those airports and call the center number in the chart supplement to get a clearance in IMC, that sort of opens the door to reasons number 2 and 3. But anyway, just trying to figure out why are they doing that. License to learn. And you know what? That is just so awesome. I love having sort of back and forths like this. I mean, yeah, it's a little sketchy sometimes for me to put reasons in writing that are not 100% known. I mean, let's face it, things are pretty uniform across the NAS, and you are safe in assuming that, yes, we at the FAA do have policies and procedures for just about everything. But the reality of everything in the NAS is that there is not a way, and this is pretty much straight out of the book, that you could come up with a uniform set of rules that would apply to all circumstances. So when you come up with something that's not covered directly by we use the 7110.65, that's our manual, that you're just expected to use your best judgment. And fair enough. But also, therein lies the game. But anyway, I feel like that's why things are sort of the way they are. So, Russ, thank you so much for your support of the show and for your questions. And of course, I am not the actual official user's manual for air traffic controller. That is, again, the 7110.65. And the point of the show is just to talk and have a great time learning and sharing information. But I am not officially interpreting rules on behalf of the FAA. You know that from the outro. Anyway, let's get to another question about air traffic, and it's from Brian Bowden. I hopefully you pronounced your name right, Brian. Via Instagram, he says, in a recent IFR training flight, I had an exchange with an approach controller which made me question my understanding of when to fly a course reversal. We, myself and my double I, were, quote, cleared direct to an initial approach fix, cleared ILS 24, maintained at or above 3,000 until established, end quote. We flew the depicted hold in lieu of the procedure turn at the initial approach fix and were scolded on the radio for entering the PT. We had requested, quote, straight in, but didn't, in our opinions, hear anything in the clearance that implied skipping the depicted procedure turn. I'm interested in your opinion on when and when not to fly the published hold or procedure turn. Are there situations when straight in is implied rather than being explicitly instructed? Also, I enjoy the podcast, especially that recent episode with Pam. That was a really enjoyable conversation to listen to. Thank you for providing that opportunity. Pam sounds delightful. Well, Brian, Pam is delightful. Thank you so much for the kind words as well. So here's what I did. I looked it up in the .65. And lo, the 7110.65 did say on page 4-8-3, paragraph C, except for visual approaches, do not clear an aircraft direct to the final approach fix unless it is also an initial approach fix wherein the aircraft is expected to execute the depicted procedure turn or hold in lieu of a procedure turn. Intercept angles greater than 90 degrees may be used when a procedure turn, a hold in lieu of a procedure turn pattern, or an arrival holding is depicted and the pilot will execute the procedure. If the procedure turn, hold in lieu of a procedure turn, or arrival holding pattern is depicted and the angle of intercept is 90 degrees or less, the aircraft must be instructed to conduct a straight-in approach if ATC does not want the pilot to execute a procedure turn or hold in lieu of procedure turn. See figure 483. Phraseology: cleared straight-in blank approach. Note: restate, quote, cleared straight-in the approach clearance, even if the pilot was advised earlier to expect a straight-in approach. Note 2. Some approach charts have an arrival holding pattern depicted on the initial approach fix using a thin line holding symbol. Get started where holding is frequently required prior to starting the approach clearance so that the detailed holding instructions are not required. Note 2. Some approach charts have a arrival holding pattern depicted on the initial approach fix using a thin line holding symbol. It started where holding is frequently required prior to starting the approach procedure, so the detailed holding instructions are not required. The arrival holding pattern is not authorized unless assigned by ATC. For instance, cleared direct second intersection, maintain at or above 3,000 until second, cleared straight in ILS runway 18 approach. And again, this is on page 483 of the 7110.65, the order titled Air Traffic Control, and it's called Approach Clearance Example for Aircraft on a Conventional Approach. And I think that covers whether you're going direct to the fix or getting vectored, and it's more than 90 degrees. So Brian, again, thank you so much for sending that in. And if anybody else has any comments or stories they'd like to share about that, I'd love to hear it. All right. Well, hopefully you feel enlightened or at least entertained by now. And going back to the Boeing thing, remember that my purpose in talking about this is not to disparage or hate on Boeing at all, and that I just want this to all be behind us, much like the pandemic, all of the political strife, the Boeing thing, all of 2020 in its entirety. You get the gist of it. But hopefully that as the world returns to some amount of functionality again, whether it's different or not, we can all move on and just feel good about getting back to aviation and our lives as they once were a couple years ago. So you may have some thoughts on what you've heard today, and if you'd like to share them, today's episode is proof positive that your feedback might actually end up on the show. You know where to send it. Brandon at podcastingonaplane.com, and let me know what you think. Plus, you can use your smartphone or SpeakPipe widget that pops up when you visit podcastingonaplane.com to record me something. And like I said, it might end up on the show. While you're on the website, maybe consider supporting the show financially. If you have the means and you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on as a patron. You get episodes early and sometimes other fun stuff too. And if you're not into the recurring thing, that's cool. There's a PayPal link too for whatever you feel's right. If you want to stay sharp on the mic, make sure you use affiliate code DELTA at PlainEnglishSim.com to get 10% off the best smartphone-based ATC radio comm simulator around. There's a link in the show notes for that too. And as always, I thank you so much for your support in whatever form it takes, and for listening to the show and passing the word along about this or any of your favorite aviation podcasts to a friend. That's all for now. Your frequency change is approved till next time, and you report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his, and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie and fun, but is in no way, shape or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.